Thank you.
My name is Daniel Mirda, and I'm also a medical oncologist as well as president of ANCO, which is the Northern Oncology Association of Physicians. I'm also a member of the CMA. We represent physicians from the community, academic institutions, and foundations. So on behalf of ANCO, I'm here to voice our opposition to SB 128. ANCO opposes legislation for several specific reasons. First, we oppose legislation because it is contrary to the physician oath and primary responsibility to do no harm. Physicians take this responsibility very seriously. Fundamentally, a physician's duty is to ensure life, and thereby we establish a trust relationship between the physician and the patient, as well as the physician and the patient's family. We are put in this position of ending, if we are put in this position of ending people's lives by prescribing life-ending medications, this will compromise that fundamental duty and potentially destroy the trust that physicians have worked to establish over many years. But please, opposition to physician-assisted suicide must not be interpreted as meaning that hematology oncologists are not compassionate. We care passionately for our patients, as you've heard, and do all that is in our ability to provide the best and most effective palliative and end-of-life care. However, we feel prescribing end-of-life medications is ethically questionable, undermines physician's primary responsibility to his patient by safeguarding life and providing comfort to their suffering. And this may be viewed as the ultimate abandonment of our patients, which is of major concern to most physicians. Second, legalizing physician-assisted suicide undermines the valuable and overwhelming success of our hospice and pain and palliative care colleagues. We work as a team. Hematology oncologists believe that there are many additional important steps that California can take to improve end-of-life care for terminally ill patients. Finally, the legislation is based on a common misunderstanding that it is easy to determine what is terminal. We are the first to recognize that it's notoriously difficult for physicians to know when their patients are terminal, and despite a physician's prognosis, many patients outlive a terminal diagnosis. Beyond these specific reasons for opposing SB 128, ANCO believes legalizing physician-assisted suicide will cause several unintended consequences. These include driving a wedge of mistrust between physicians and their patients on the issue of end-of-life care, and adding a level of ambiguity to physician-patient relationships during the end of life, as well as uncontrolled circulation of dangerous life-ending medications when patients have prescribed these drugs and do not use them immediately, and deep and emotional divisions in families facing serious illnesses as to the end-of-life care. This could lead to divisive litigation amongst family members as they fight over the application of the law to their terminally ill patients. Finally, physicians in California interact with many different cultures, and it has taken a great deal of effort to gain their trust, decrease barriers to care that are simply the result of misunderstanding due to language and customs. The introduction of assisted suicide option could lead to further barriers in caring for these diverse cultures that we encounter here in California, and certainly could engender mistrust. By way of information, ANCO, or Association of Northern California Oncologists, is dedicated to assisting oncologists and their staff to deliver the highest quality care by providing a form of exchange of ideas, data, before state and federal government agencies. Regional and national oncology and medical societies, insurance, and pharmaceutical companies are also included. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Marilyn Golden, Senior Policy Analyst with the Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund. Is this picking up adequately? Okay, thanks. We're a national law and policy center on disability civil rights, and I stand here with the thousands of opponents to this bill, including people with disabilities who were not able to get to the room today, speaking against this bill. My heart, like everyone's, went out to Brittany Bernard and her family and others in similar situations like those who spoke here today. However, our concerns are for other reasons. Where assisted suicide is legal, some people's lives will be ended without their consent through mistakes and abuse. No safeguards have ever been enacted or even proposed that can prevent that outcome, which can never be undone. Why? For one thing, it's a deadly mix to combine our broken, profit-driven healthcare system and assisted suicide, which would instantly become the cheapest treatment. Direct coercion is not even necessary. If insurers deny or even merely delay approval of expensive, life-sustaining treatment, patients are steered towards hastening their deaths. Do we think insurers will do the right thing or the cheap thing? This applies to public insurers as well. Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroop, Oregonians with cancer, were both informed by the Oregon Health Plan that the plan wouldn't pay for a prescribed chemotherapy, but would pay for, among other things, their assisted suicide. Though called a free choice for these patients, it would have been a phony form of freedom. And remember that Oregon is largely white. California's diverse communities, particularly those of Latinos and African Americans, unfortunately face much larger healthcare disparities than those found in Oregon, making for an even more deadly mix with our broken healthcare system. Let's talk about danger and abuse. Elder abuse is a rising problem in every state, and abuse of people with disabilities as well. This policy is a recipe for elder abuse, where assisted suicide is legal. An heir, that is someone who stands to inherit from the ill person, or an abusive caregiver, can steer someone towards it, can legally be one of the witnesses for their request, can pick up the lethal dose for them, and in the end even give the drug because no objective witnesses are required at the death, so who would know? This committee's analysis acknowledges that there have been documented abuses. When proponents claim there have been no abuses in Oregon, based on no evidence, let us remember Kate Cheney. Let us remember Michael Freeland, a man with a 43-year history of depression and suicide attempts, who was nevertheless prescribed lethal drugs in Oregon. Where were the safeguards in his case? Let us remember Wendy Melcher and Linda Fleming and Thomas Middleton, whose cases showed economic pressures and financial abuse. These are just some of the cases we know about. What of those that have gone unreported? More about the circumstances of those individuals I named in a moment. I want to point out, before I go further, that there is a legal solution today for end-of-life pain. It is important to know that anyone dying in discomfort that is not otherwise relievable or being relieved may legally now in California and every state receive something else that's different than the standard palliative care. It's called palliative sedation, wherein the patient is sedated to the point where the discomfort is relieved while the dying process takes place. So we already have a legal solution to any uncomfortable deaths that does not endanger others the way an assisted suicide law does. I want to talk about the vaunted supposed safeguards in this bill, which are actually utterly hollow. The oncologists who spoke before me, Dr. Fong and Dr. Murda, talked about how 6 months to live is often incorrect. And I want to explain how that can be how those incorrect prognoses, which are common in medicine, can have deadly consequences if assisted suicide is legal. Jeanette Hall, an Oregonian diagnosed with cancer and given 6 months to a year to live in the year 2000, sought to die under the Oregon law. Her doctor persuaded her to fight the disease, and she is alive and well nearly 15 years later and grateful to be. But she was so afraid she was going to do this and take her life. She is so happy she didn't. John Norton, who lived in a state where there was no assisted suicide, was diagnosed with ALS at age 18, that is Lou Gehrig's disease, and given 3 to 5 years to live. 6 years later, the progression of his disease suddenly stopped. He is alive today at 77 with a wife, children, and retired from a successful career. He stated that if assisted suicide had been legal at the time, he would have used it, but is so grateful he could not, because he had a long, happy life because after that incorrect prognosis. There's other problems with safeguards. Doctor shopping gets around any of the hollow safeguards in this bill. What is that? That's when if you ask for lethal drugs and your doctor says, no, you don't qualify, you or your family shops for another doctor who will say yes. That's what happened to Kate Cheney, age 85 in Oregon. Although a psychiatrist concluded that she had dementia and was being pressured by her daughter, the family found another doctor and she later died from the lethal prescription. So that's what came of that safeguard. And did you know that the overwhelming majority of reported Oregon deaths were facilitated in some way by the pro-assisted suicide organization Compassion and Choices, formerly called Compassion in Dying, and years ago at the beginning of it was known as the Hemlock Society. They can refer you to a doctor if yours says no. Family pressures is another safeguard issue. Whether the pressure is financial or emotional, that pressure can distort patient choice and get around any safeguard. Let's look at just one aspect of this, economic pressures. Two stories. First, one of economic pressure. The second is financial abuse. Economic pressure, Linda Fleming. The first to use the Washington state law was divorced, had financial problems, had been unable to work due to a disability, and was forced to declare bankruptcy. Yet the head of Compassion and Choices in Washington said that her situation presented, quote, none of the red flags that might have caused his group pause in supporting her request for death. Yet we're told by proponents that financial pressures have never played a role. Second, financial abuse. Thomas Middleton was diagnosed with ALS, moved into the home of Tammy Sawyer, and died by assisted suicide later that very month. Thomas Middleton had named Tammy Sawyer his estate trustee and put his home in her trust. 2 days after he died, Tammy Sawyer listed the property for sale and deposited $90,000 into her own account. It took a federal investigation into real estate fraud to expose this abuse. Tammy Sawyer was indicted for first-degree criminal mistreatment and first-degree aggravated theft, partly over criminal mistreatment of Thomas Middleton. But the Oregon agency responsible for the assisted suicide law never even noticed. The Oregon model, which this bill is based on, is characterized by a lack of oversight, a lack of monitoring, and by secrecy, not transparency. The minimal published statistical data derived from asking a prescribing doctor a few questions, and that's all, looks fine on the surface, but this data does not reflect what's actually happening. It's not what the data shows, it's what the data fails to show. There is no investigation for abuse. Oregon, the data shows no abuses because the system is not set up to find abuses. The state readily admits they have no funding nor authority to investigate anything. SB 128 is the same. One example of the lack of transparency under SB 128, doctors are required to falsify death certificates by saying the cause of death was the underlying illness and not the lethal prescription, even if the person took the lethal drugs during a month when they have no symptoms of their disease. So it hides the ball, making accurate data impossible to collect. Bills nearly identical to this one have been rejected over 140 times in 25 U.S. states. Last year, bills were defeated in 7 states, including Colorado, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Already in 2015, since Brittany Menard's case was publicized, it was defeated in 4 states. When lawmakers see the fine print, the dangers and problems, these bills are rejected. Let's look at all the unanswered questions around this bill. First, at a supposed safeguard to see if California's people with psychiatric disabilities would be safe. Are depressed persons who are misdiagnosed as terminal, and are they given lethal drugs? The answer to that question is, we don't know. In Oregon, where in the last few years only in 3% of reported cases were people sent for a psychological assessment, according to Oregon's own figures, yet depression is the most common cause of a request for death. Have people whose depression could have been successfully treated died in Oregon? We can't know. Let's look at those annual statistical reports mandated by the Oregon law and SB 128. Do they show the full picture? Oregon statistics are based solely on self-reporting by doctors. Reporting is required on paper, but there's no penalties if doctors don't report. How many have failed to report? We don't know. The law authorizes no investigations, nor does this bill. How many people who died under the Oregon law first asked their own doctors and were told no? We don't know. That isn't counted. This should be off. Sorry. How accurate and comprehensive are the Oregon statistics? We don't know, because the state has acknowledged that it actually destroys the underlying data once each annual report is published, making independent verification impossible. Have people used assisted suicide who could have lived many happy years if treated? We can't know. How many doctors wrote lethal prescriptions for multiple people in the last few years? We don't know, because starting in about 2006, the Oregon reports stopped telling us. Why? We don't know. How many people actually use assisted suicide for pain rather than depression or fear of the future? Before, I believe in 2006, it was very low. But now we can no longer know, because starting then, the report combined inadequate pain control now with fear of future inadequate pain control. Oregon has successfully kept hidden how few people actually use lethal drugs due to pain. Why? We don't know. Do we really want to base California law on so many unanswered questions? Assisted suicide is bad medicine for California. Please oppose this risky, reckless bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about a little over 6.5 minutes. Please state your name.
Dr. Aaron Cariati. I'm the director of the program in medical ethics at UC Irvine School of Medicine. And I speak as a physician, as a medical ethicist, and as a psychiatrist with expertise in suicide. In my own medical practice, I see and treat suicidal patients routinely, whose life stories are every bit as heartbreaking as Brittany Menard's, and whose reasons for wanting to die might, at first glance, seem just as compelling. But we know that suicide is nearly always a cry for help. It's not a desire to die. So as a physician, I have a duty to intervene and try to prevent suicidal behavior. And research shows that patients are later grateful for those interventions. That's certainly been my own clinical experience. A law allowing assisted suicide for some individuals creates two groups of patients who no longer enjoy equal protection under the law and who no longer receive equal medical care. Assisted suicide is therefore discriminatory, and the basis of discrimination is the patient's health status. Under SB 128, I would intervene to save Robin Williams and get him through a crisis. But I would assist Brittany Maynard in taking her own life. These two contradictory approaches to suicide are fundamentally incompatible. They can't coexist within medicine and mental health care. Something will have to give. So my first reason to consider is that physician-assisted suicide introduces a discriminatory practice into medicine. It undermines equal protection for all patients and weakens necessary efforts at suicide prevention. If there exists a right to assisted suicide, why would it be restricted to those in the throes of terminal illness? Once we adopt the principle that suicide is acceptable in law, then the fences that we try to erect around it, having 6 months to live, having mental capacity, these things are inevitably arbitrary. And these restrictions will eventually be abandoned, as the situation with assisted suicide in Belgium and the Netherlands demonstrates. These cases are instructive because those countries have been at this longer than Oregon and Washington. In Belgium, just to mention a few examples, assisted suicide has been granted to a man with, quote, untreatable depression, to a prisoner suffering psychological anguish because of his imprisonment. In the Netherlands, assisted suicide was recently granted to a woman because she didn't want to live in a nursing home and had no other housing options. So we see evidence here not only of a practical slippery slope, that restrictions will be difficult to enforce or monitor. We see a relentlessly logical slippery slope, because once this supposed right to assisted suicide is adopted, these restrictions are groundless. They're eventually abandoned. Suicide is now a public health crisis. Alarmingly, suicide is the third leading cause of death among adolescents and young adults. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States overall. And we know that suicide is typically an impulsive and an ambivalent act. A journalist tracked down the few dozen individuals who have survived suicide attempts by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And he asked them, what was going through your minds between the 4 seconds when you jumped and when you hit the water? Every single one of them said the same thing, that they regretted the decision to jump, with one of them saying, I realized in an instant that all the problems in my life that I thought were unsolvable were actually solvable, except for having just jumped. Those who work in palliative care will confirm that when a terminally ill patient professes that they want to die, this is a cry for help. This is a cry for assistance. And when comfort or relief is offered in the form of more adequate treatment for depression, better palliative care, more comprehensive treatment, this desire for suicide vanishes. Nearly 90% of suicides are associated with clinical depression or other treatable mental disorders, including for individuals at the end of life. Yet alarmingly, less than 6% of those reported cases who have died by assisted suicide under Oregon's law were ever referred for psychiatric evaluation. Similarly, SB 128 does not require that physicians refer for psychiatric consultation to rule out the most common mental disorders that contribute to suicidal thinking. Based on what we know about suicide risk factors, this constitutes a form of gross medical negligence. Now, suicide completion generally requires not just intent, which typically waxes and wanes over time, it also requires easy access to means. Suicidal individuals tend to fixate on one particular plan, and if that means isn't available, they don't choose a backup plan, they typically choose to live. I had this experience recently with a 79-year-old man who requested from me physician-assisted suicide. He decided to give up on his suicidal plan when he discovered that neither I nor my colleagues at UC Irvine would provide this for him, and when we began to address some of his family problems. And so my third reason is that assisted suicide will lead to the medical abandonment of vulnerable individuals, especially those suffering from treatable mental illnesses like depression or anxiety. Now, assisted suicide advocates claim that we need this option to deal with situations of intolerable pain. But in the data, the inadequate data, but the data that we have from Oregon, most patients requested assisted suicide not because of concerns about pain, but because of fears of loss of autonomy, and most importantly, the fear of becoming a burden on other people. We need to communicate to each and every patient, you are not a burden, and we'll continue to care for you even when cure is no longer possible. Assisted suicide advocates insist that this is a purely private decision, an exercise in personal autonomy that doesn't affect other people. But scientific research has repeatedly demonstrated a social contagion effect to suicide, which leads to copycat suicide. So these individual decisions have impact on other vulnerable individuals. They have social effects that epidemiologists have measured over and over again. It's noteworthy that the overall suicide rates in Oregon rose dramatically in the years following the legalization of assisted suicide in that state in '97. After Oregon suicide rates dropped in the early 1990s, they rose between 2000 and 2010 at a steep pitch, surpassing the rate of increase nationally, and are now 35% higher than the national average. And so to my fourth reason, the legalization of physician-assisted suicide sends a message that some lives are not worth living. The law is a teacher. If assisted suicide is legalized, this message will be heard by everyone who's tempted by suicidal thoughts and tendencies. Advocates are trying to redefine suicide. Compassionate Choices claims that, quote, physician aid in dying is not really suicide, simply because the means employed, taking a deadly drug, are, as they say, nonviolent and peaceful. This attempt to manipulate language and to do an end run around hard realities is irresponsible and deceptive. The definition of suicide is clear, and it doesn't depend on the particular means employed. So we need to call this by its name. Senate Bill 128 is not a modest proposal. It is not one small step in expanding end-of-life medical options. It is not an extension of already existing palliative care practices. No, it's a radical departure from sound medical practice. The American Medical Association's policy states that physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as a healer, would be difficult or impossible to control, and would pose serious societal risks. To maintain our professional integrity, medicine's mandate must always remain this: when possible, we cure; always, we care; but never do we kill. SB 128 is not only bad law for the profession of medicine, more importantly, it's bad law for the patients that we serve. Thank you.
We've exceeded the time. How many others? There's two. In all fairness, I'll give one more presenter a short amount of time, but we've already exceeded the time allotted for the first.
Need less than 2 minutes.
Okay, go ahead.
So, yeah, you can have 1 minute. It's okay with
Or
me.
you
if
do
it's okay
one
with
minute each is fine.
Okay. all
1
right.
minute each.
Terrific. All right, I'm the Reverend James Wilson. I'm the president of Pray North State. I'm here at the request of Senator Nielsen. And I just want to tell this, just a very, very quick story about my own mother, who, when she was terminally ill, requested that I help her to end her life. My faith forbids me to do that, and I said to her, I cannot in good conscience do this. I will see to it that nobody prolongs your life unnecessarily, but I can't help you to end it. And when that was clear between us, it fundamentally changed her relationship with me, with her family, with her God. She died in peace because of the unfinished business she was able to take care of when she was not offered a quick and theoretically cheap way out. I can say the same thing about my cousin Bruce, who simply needed permission from his family and friends to let go, not an assist in going. And he died in peace within a few hours of that. I can tell you countless other stories. There's not time to do it. But I will say this. In my experience of 30 years as a pastor, walking with people through the end of their life, some I knew very well, some not so well, when they are enabled, when they're given permission to finish the unfinished business they have with family, with friends, with God, they go very, very quickly and generally at peace. And if we cut that off, we're not people who've been born for such a time as this. We're people who are taking such a time as this from people we need to stand with. There is a big difference, a major league difference, between maintaining a shadow life, which we should not do, and hastening the end. And I just want to ask this question. In California, do we not already have enough blood on our hands? We lead the state.
Please.
In the murder of people like Native Americans over the last 200 years. We lead the state in elective suicide, independently of this bill. We lead the state in elective abortions. Do we really need more? Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. My name is Margaret Dorr. I'm going to stay in the 1 minute.
Hold on. I allowed each 1 minute, and
You went
you went two, so I'll be more than fair. We'll do you 30 seconds. And before you speak, please, we need to respect both sides. If we can just keep all comments, whether you agree or disagree, be respectful. So 30 seconds.
Okay, my name is Margaret Dorr. I'm an attorney from Washington State, where assisted suicide is legal. I have a memo with more copies to give to people if you want them. First, we're not talking about people necessarily at the end of life. Under the language of the bill, an 18-year-old with diabetes would qualify. Second, I direct your attention to the death certificate instruction that I attach at A52, which is in Washington State, that just because our law is used, the prosecutor must certify it as natural. Not if our law was complied with, but just because it was used. I strongly urge you to read that there is no accountability. A prosecutor, even if there was overreaching, must treat the death as natural. Thank you so much. And I do have more copies if somebody wants this. I'm in the back.
Thank you very much. We're going to do this. We're going to allow a few of the opponents, and we're going to allow a few of the proponents to come up. We're going to open it up to questions for the members, but I'd like to have both sides here on the dais to answer questions if members have questions. So we're going to give a few minutes to at least allow half of these individuals to step down, and the proponents, if they can choose who they'd like to have come up in case questions are asked of them. Do we have both proponents and opponents here so we can present questions to the members?
Mr. Chair, let one of these guys on the end, Mr. Chair, move out of the way so she can scoot up to the desk.
Why don't you guys move this way so we can get somebody with a wheelchair to come up front?
Sharon, you should stay where you are.
Okay, now, okay, let me have everyone's attention. I think we have most of the individuals up here. Those of you that are here, the only time you will be allowed to speak if a question is addressed to you from a member. At this point, it'll be the members will be allowed to ask questions and/or make comments. And the audience, please, if they could refrain from any comments whatsoever. So is there any questions or comments from any of the members?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Senator Isidore Hall.
Thank you. I'm just curious, walk me through the process here. I'm sick, I'm terminally ill, I get an evaluation from a doctor, I have a psychiatrist or a psychologist evaluate me to make sure that I'm mentally capable of such a decision as this. Then I go through other processes to make sure that I'm, you know, an okay patient to make this decision consciously. So I'm not just haphazardly making a decision and folks saying, okay, you're good to go. I've heard testimony to the likes of that, and I'm just curious about the process to make sure that one is mentally stable, capable, able, have been evaluated by both a doctor and a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Can someone walk me through that process?
With the
Senator.
permission of the
Yes,
chair, we
by all
can ask Dr. Gruby, who's had experience here.
In
with
Oregon.
In Oregon.
Thank you.